Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely. Always ready to explore something new.
Well, today we're looking at something, honestly, I'd never really connected before. Autism and shopping addiction.
Yeah, that's one of those things you don't necessarily think about right away.
It was a total wait, what
Mm,
moment for me.
right,
But the more you dig in, it's like, oh, wow, I see how those pieces fit together.
for sure.
Our main source today is a blog post, and it's from Cheap ABA. It's called The Hidden Struggle, Autism and Shopping Addiction.
And cheap ABA, for anyone who's not familiar, they're all about applied behavior analysis therapy, ABA therapy for autism.
So they're working directly with people on the spectrum.
Exactly, seeing these patterns firsthand, which makes their insights even more valuable.
Yeah, it's not just theoretical. They're in the trenches, so to speak.
Absolutely.
Okay, so before we get too deep into the autism connection, let's
Yeah.
talk about the shopping addiction piece. What are we actually talking about here? Is it just like someone who loves a good sale? Or is there something more serious going on?
Oh, it goes way beyond just enjoying a good deal.
Okay.
We're talking about a real behavioral pattern. Clinically, it's called oneomania.
Oh, nautomania.
Yeah, it's where shopping becomes the way you deal with difficult emotions.
Oh, so it's like a coping mechanism.
Exactly. And that can lead to compulsive buying, even when you know you can't afford it, don't need it, the whole nine yards.
That instant gratification hit, but not dealing with the actual problem underneath.
Unfortunately, yeah.
And this can happen to anyone, right? It's not
Yeah.
limited to a specific group of people.
Right. Anyone can fall into that trap.
Okay, so then what's the autism connection? Why are we talking about this specifically in relation to autism?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. People on the autism spectrum, they might be more likely to develop shopping addiction.
More likely, okay. Why is that? What makes autistic individuals more vulnerable to this?
So one key factor is something called executive function.
Okay, I've heard of that, usually in relation to ADHD, I think.
It comes up a lot there, but it's relevant to autism too.
Interesting.
Executive function, it's basically your brain's management system.
Mm.
It helps you plan, organize, control impulses.
So if your executive function isn't quite as strong, it's harder to resist those urges, like the urge to buy something.
Exactly. You might know logically it's not a good idea, but that stop signal in your brain isn't strong enough.
That makes a lot of sense. And then there's the sensory piece too, right?
Right. Shopping can be a sensory overload, especially for someone on the autism spectrum.
Oh yeah, all those lights, sounds, crowds.
Exactly. It can be incredibly overwhelming.
So in that moment, buying something might feel like the only way to escape that feeling.
Exactly, like an escape hatch. And the author of this blog post actually talks about that in their own experience.
Oh, they share their personal story.
They do, and it's really powerful. They describe how even when they knew logically they shouldn't buy something, they still struggled with that impulse control.
It's like getting trapped in a cycle. Temporary relief through shopping, but then the guilt and maybe the financial problems pile up.
Exactly. That cycle of relief and regret is a big part of addiction, whether it's shopping or something
So
else.
it's not just about having too many shoes. This is something that can have real consequences.
Absolutely. We're talking financial strain, potential relationship issues. It impacts your overall well-being.
So what can you do if you're listening to this thinking, oh, this sounds familiar? Does the blog give any advice for getting out of that cycle?
Yeah, they actually have some really practical tips, and I love that they acknowledge there's no magic bullet. It takes effort,
Okay, good to know there's hope.
definitely.
Okay, so spill the beans. What are these magical tips?
Well, not magical, but definitely helpful.
Mm.
One of the big ones is budgeting.
Budgeting, okay.
But it's not just about tracking your spending after the fact. It's about being proactive.
Like setting a limit before you even go shopping.
Exactly. Whether it's online or in person, knowing your limit beforehand can help you avoid those impulse buys.
That makes sense. But for someone who's already struggling with executive function, like we talked about, wouldn't that kind of planning be tough?
Oh, for sure. And that's where the next tip comes in, understanding your triggers.
Triggers, okay.
Yeah. What are the situations or emotions that make you want to shop? Is it stress, boredom, loneliness, seeing a tempting ad?
So once you know what your triggers are, you can come up with ways to deal with them that don't involve shopping.
Exactly. Like, instead of reaching for your credit card when you're feeling down, maybe you call a friend, go for a walk, listen to music.
Find something else that gives you that little boost.
You got it. And this is where a good support system can be huge. The blog really emphasizes that you don't have to go through this alone.
Yeah, talking to someone you trust, a friend, family member, therapist.
Right. it can make a world of difference.
I think it's easy to feel ashamed about something like shopping addiction, but keeping it a secret just makes it worse.
Absolutely. And speaking of keeping things hidden, the blog touched on something I found really interesting: the connection between shopping addiction and social masking.
Social masking.
Yeah, it's something a lot of autistic people do, often without even realizing it.
Okay, what is it?
Basically, it's trying to fit in with neurotypical social expectations.
So like suppressing your natural behaviors, copying others.
Exactly. And it can be exhausting, emotionally, mentally draining.
I can see how that would be.
Yeah.
So is the idea that shopping could be a form of masking too?
Yeah, that's the thought. Imagine you're feeling out of place like you don't belong.
Hmm.
Buying the right clothes, gadgets, whatever's trendy, it could feel like a way to fit in, create this appearance of normalcy.
Wow, that's kind of sad, but I get it.
Yeah. It really highlights how deep this issue goes.
It's not just about stuff, it's about those underlying emotional needs.
Right. And if you don't address those needs, the cycle just keeps going.
Definitely. And it's not just autistic individuals who experience this, right?
Yeah.
Our whole culture kind of pushes shopping as a way to feel better, celebrate things.
Oh, absolutely. Treat yourself. The latest gadget will make you happy. We hear it all the time.
That retail therapy mentality.
Yeah.
But like you said earlier, it's just a Band-Aid.
Exactly. And that's why the blog's focus on healthy alternatives is so important.
Finding things that actually bring you joy, and it's probably not at the mall.
Probably not. So stepping back a bit, what other societal factors play into shopping addiction? We've talked about marketing, the retail therapy thing. What else?
Well, there's definitely the pressure to keep up with the Joneses, right?
Oh, huge one. Social media is constantly showing us these perfect lives, the latest must-haves.
Makes you feel like you need to be buying new stuff all the time to be happy.
Yeah, it's this constant comparison, envy. And for someone already struggling with impulse control or social anxiety, that pressure can be brutal.
Absolutely. It's like you're constantly being told you're not good enough unless you have the newest this, the trendiest that.
And if you're already feeling vulnerable, that message can really do damage.
Something that struck me while I was prepping for this, we often think about shopping addiction in adults, but what about teenagers?
Oh, that's a really good point.
They're even more susceptible to peer pressure, trends, all that.
Definitely. Plus, their brains are still developing those impulse control, decision-making skills. It's like a recipe for problems.
So what can parents or caregivers do to, help prevent shopping addiction in teens, especially if they're on the spectrum?
Well, I think open communication is key. Talking about the pressures they face, helping them develop healthy coping mechanisms.
And setting clear boundaries around spending.
Yeah, for sure. And teaching them to be critical consumers, helping them understand how marketing works, resist those impulses.
It's about empowering them to make conscious choices,
Yeah.
value experiences over stuff.
Exactly.
Speaking of experiences, I remember reading about some malls doing sensory-friendly hours for kids with autism.
Oh, yeah.
They dim the lights, lower the music, create a calmer environment. Do you think something like that could be good for adults too?
That's a fantastic idea.
Right.
Making shopping more inclusive and accessible could be a game changer for people with sensory sensitivities, autism or not.
It would take some of the pressure off,
Mm.
knowing you could shop without feeling overwhelmed.
For sure. And it sends a message that everyone deserves to feel comfortable in public spaces.
This whole conversation has me think about my own shopping habits. I would say I'm a shopaholic, but I definitely do the impulse buy thing sometimes.
I think most of us do to some degree. It's so ingrained in our culture.
It is. But the important thing is to be aware of those patterns and find healthier ways to deal with our emotions, meet our needs. So beyond what we've already talked about, what are some practical steps people can take to curb those shopping impulses?
Yeah.
To be more mindful about spending?
Well, for me, sometimes it helps to just take a breath before I click buy now.
Oh yeah, that pause can be huge.
It's like, okay, wait, do I really need this? Or am I just being impulsive?
Right, give yourself a chance to step back from that initial urge, figure out what's really driving it.
And sometimes even just asking myself, what feeling am I trying to avoid right now or create? That can be really eye-opening.
It is. Getting curious about those emotions can help you break that cycle.
So besides that pause, any other strategies you'd recommend?
Something that's helped me is unsubscribing from all those tempting email lists and social media accounts.
Ooh, yeah, all those sales and new products popping up constantly.
It's like a digital detox for your shopping impulses.
Love that. It's so easy to get sucked in, feeling like you're missing out.
It is. Oh, and this one might sound a little weird, but spend more time in nature.
Huh. Interesting. Seriously, studies show being outdoors can reduce stress, boost your mood, even your self-esteem.
It's like getting a dose of natural therapy instead of retail therapy.
Exactly. And it's free.
Always a bonus. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. The autism and shopping addiction link, executive function, sensory overload, social masking, societal pressures.
hmm
What's the big takeaway? What should people remember?
I think the most important thing is shopping addiction is a real issue. It's complex. It's not about being materialistic or lacking willpower.
Right.
It's often a symptom of something deeper, a way of coping, and that's especially true for people on the autism spectrum.
And there's no shame in asking for help.
Not at all. There are therapists, support groups, resources out there to help people break free from this cycle.
Absolutely. It starts with self-compassion,
Mm.
recognizing you're not alone and there's a path to recovery.
Couldn't agree more.
The author of this blog post from Cheap ABA, their honesty about their own experience was really powerful.
It is. It helps break down that stigma, that shame.
Yeah, it's so important to hear those firsthand accounts, to know you're not the only one going through this.
Definitely gives hope to others who are struggling.
So, one final thought for our listeners as we wrap up this deep dive. We talked a lot about individual strategies, support systems, but what about systemic change? How can we, as a society, create a more supportive environment for people who are dealing with this?
That's a great question. Maybe it's about pushing for more ethical marketing, challenging this whole consumerism culture.
Creating spaces that are more sensory friendly, like those malls we talked about.
Right. There's a lot to think about, and it's a conversation we need to keep having.
Absolutely. So to our listeners, keep exploring these ideas, keep asking questions, keep the conversation going, and remember, you're not alone. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.